Hi, it's Kim, and I'm here to talk to you about photosynthesis. This is a very basic lecture on photosynthesis. It's definitely not meant to make you a photosynthesis expert. It's just laying down that really basic foundation of information. It is the most important chemical process on Earth, so it is important for you to know something about it. And this general equation for photosynthesis you've seen before, and it should also look really familiar because it is the reverse of the general equation for cellular respiration. Remember, in cellular respiration, glucose and oxygen were the reactants and carbon dioxide and water were the products. Now those are reversed. So why is photosynthesis the most important chemical process on Earth? The answers lie in this general equation. Let's start at the end here with oxygen. Photosynthetic organisms produce and release oxygen, and this is the oxygen we breathe. So that's incredibly important. They produce carbohydrates. They are the only organisms who can take light energy from the sun and convert it into chemical energy in the form of the covalent bonds of the sugars they produce. This then provides energy for cellular respiration for the entire rest of the food chain. Photosynthetic organisms aren't being charitable. They produce carbohydrates because they do not eat. They have to make their own energy to carry out their own cellular respiration. But in the process, they provide that energy for the entire food chain. No life on Earth would exist without photosynthesis. And lastly, they remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That's incredibly important, especially right now when we are, as humans, producing far too much carbon dioxide, causing our planet to warm. And we're also doing things like deforestation and having other global impacts that reduce the capacity of photosynthetic organisms to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So we've really upset that balance. Here's a summary of the importance of photosynthesis. It removes carbon dioxide, it produces oxygen, and makes carbohydrates for the entire food chain. Those are three very important things. And again, no life on Earth would exist without these photosynthetic organisms being able to do this. Who carries out photosynthesis? Bacteria called cyanobacteria. These are bacteria that have chloroplasts and were probably some of the earliest organisms to release oxygen on our planet and allow for oxygen consuming organisms to exist. Protists that are photosynthetic are incredibly important. They are the base of the food chain in ocean systems and other aquatic systems. Very, very important. And then all plants are photosynthetic. Photosynthetic organisms are called autotrophs. So autotrophs produce their own food. They are also called the producers, and they are the base of the food chain in all ecosystems. Organisms that eat autotrophs are called heterotrophs, and heterotrophs also eat other heterotrophs. But if you eat your food, you're called a heterotroph. If you produce your own food, you're called an autotroph. So heterotrophs have to eat, compared to autotrophs, which are organisms that produce their own food. This pyramid really shows you the relative abundance of the different trophic levels within an ecosystem, and you can see that producers are the most abundant. So in a healthy functioning ecosystem, producers need to be the most abundant. Those are then eaten by the primary consumers. The other term for primary consumer is an herbivore. So herbivores are the primary consumers. Those primary consumers are then eaten by secondary consumer so a secondary consumer would be a carnivore. So if you eat a cow, you are eating the herbivore, which would make you a secondary consumer or a carnivore. We're of course omnivores, so we eat at both trophic levels. We can eat plants, in which case we're eating as an herbivore, or we can be a carnivore. So since we're both, we're what's called an omnivore. Sorry, that was really loud. If we were just eating meat, we would be called carnivores. So if you are eating up here, that means you're eating an organism that ate the herbivore that ate the plant. So if you ate a snake, you would be considered a tertiary consumer. It's a second level carnivore, a secondary carnivore. This is a really, really important ecological concept, and I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it's important to realize that at each trophic level, there is a huge energy loss as that energy is passed from one trophic level to the other. So if you look even at the amount of energy that was available in the sunlight, only 10% of that is transferred to the plants or the other photosynthetic organism. Then only 10% of that is passed to the herbivore. So by the time you become a tertiary consumer up here, you're really not getting a lot of bang for your buck. This is not an efficient way to eat. The lower you eat in this pyramid, the more energy you're going to get from your food. So when we eat plants, that is much more energy efficient than when we eat a cow or another, even higher up. This is review from the energy lecture. Photosynthesis is endergonic. Don't know why that was so hard for me to say. Remember, endergonic means two important things. One, it means energy input was required. Why was energy input required? Because our products have a lot more energy than the reactants. When the products have a lot more energy than the reactants, think of it as your bank balance. If you started with this low balance and you ended up with this high balance, you had to put money in to the system, money into the bank. So energy had to be put into the system to end up with these high energy products. That should be kind of intuitive because we know that carbon dioxide and water, we ate those don't provide energy, but glucose provides a lot of energy. To get to this high energy product, energy had to be put into the system. So photosynthesis is an endergonic reaction. The electron carrier in photosynthesis is NADP+. That should sound familiar too, because if you remember the two electron carriers in cellular respiration were, whoops, that one doesn't work at all. I'm just trying to find a black marker that works better than that other one. I'll try blue. Remember we had FADH, but the main electron carrier that we had was NAD+. There we go, that one's much better. In cellular respiration, the NAD+ picked up far more hydrogens than the FADH. In photosynthesis, NADP+. That P does not stand for photosynthesis, but if it helps you remember that that's the electron carrier in photosynthesis, then by all means, remember that. So when NADP+ picks up hydrogen, it becomes NADPH. Okay, just as when NAD+ picked up hydrogen, it became NADH. So you're just inserting the P there. And this little cartoon shows you our electron carrier, NADP+, picking up hydrogen ion and 2 electrons and shuttling those to the Calvin cycle, where the hydrogens are stripped away along with the electrons, and the NADP+ is regenerated. It goes back into the light reaction. We're going to see how that happens. So NADP+ is our electron carrier. I think this is incredibly interesting. This is why most plants appear green to our eyes, because the pigments in the plants are what absorbs the light to carry out photosynthesis. And this is just 2 of the pigments that occur in plants. There are other pigments, but this is chlorophyll A and B. And you can see that they absorb light in the orange and red spectrum, and then chlorophyll B is a little bit in the yellow. They also absorb the blue, but they don't absorb green. Green gets reflected, and that's why plants appear green to our eyes. Chloroplasts are green, and chloroplasts are where photosynthesis occurs. Recall that in a plant cell, there are many organelles. In fact, a lot of the same organelles that we have in our cells are in the plant cell. So if we look at this plant cell, nucleus, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi, lysosomes, ribosomes, all those structures that an animal cell has. But then plant cells also have chloroplasts. Okay, and remember, there are other organisms that carry out photosynthesis, not just plants. But I'm going to use the term plant today so that every single time I don't have to say plants, cyanobacteria, and photosynthetic protists. Realize though, when we're talking about photosynthesis, it's not just happening in plants. If I take this chloroplast, this is a chloroplast. Oops, it would help if I spelled it correctly. And I'm going to blow up that chloroplast. Inside that chloroplast is a structure that will look similar to a mitochondrion in a lot of ways. There are membranes and some structures that are really analogous to what's going on in a mitochondrion. And just as different parts of cell respiration happened in different regions of the mitochondrion, different parts of photosynthesis are going to happen in different parts of the chloroplast. The main structures you need to know about are these membranous sacs called thylakoids. Okay, so each one of these is called a thylakoid. And this is where the first stage of photosynthesis, called the light reaction, is going to take place, is in the thylakoid. And then this region out here is called the stroma. It's the liquid portion of the thylakoid. I'm sorry. It's the liquid portion of the chloroplast. And this stroma is where the Calvin cycle is going to take place. That's the second stage of photosynthesis. Okay, so this entire thing is a chloroplast. This is the thylakoid, and outside the thylakoids are the liquid portion called the stroma. A whole stack of these is called a granum. And in a second, I'm going to blow up a thylakoid for you because you need to know a little bit more detail about the thylakoid. But for now, I just want to show you this cartoon version of a chloroplast. So outer membrane, inner membrane, intermembrane space, that should look familiar because that's very similar to the structure of a mitochondrion. Liquid portion inside the chloroplast is called the stroma. And then we have these membranous sacs called thylakoids. And I'm going to draw a thylakoid for you in more detail in a second. And a stack of them is called a granum. Okay, let's blow up one of these thylakoids now. So I'm going to try this new green. Taking one of these thylakoids and blowing it up. I'm really struggling with my markers today, sorry. So this is a thylakoid. This would be called the thylakoid membrane. And this inside is called the lumen. Lumen is a term that you might have heard before. You might have heard of the lumen of the intestine. So that space inside a sac is often called the lumen. Different parts of the light reaction take place in the membrane and the lumen. So when we say the light reaction takes place in the thylakoid, we mean the whole thylakoid, in this membrane and in the lumen. This membrane is really analogous to the inner membrane of the mitochondrion because when we hear membrane, we should automatically be thinking phospholipid bilayer with some proteins embedded. And that's exactly what's happening here. This thylakoid membrane is composed of phospholipids in a bilayer with some important proteins embedded. I'm going to show you a better picture of that. A couple of slides down here. Here we go. So if we blew up that membrane, so you can see here, they're taking that membrane of one of these thylakoids and they're blowing it up. And you can see this phospholipid bilayer with proteins embedded. Those proteins make up the electron transport chain. Very similar to the electron transport chain in the inner mitochondrial membrane. You also see another familiar guy here, this enzyme, ATP synthase. Remember in cell respiration, as hydrogens pass through the ATP synthase, it phosphorylates ADP to form ATP. And the same exact thing happens in photosynthesis. So we'll see that happening in a minute. Let's go back now to this general overview of photosynthesis, now that you've seen the basic structure of a chloroplast. So two major stages, the light reaction and the Calvin cycle. Two major reactants, water and CO2. CO2 does not come in until the Calvin cycle. Carbon dioxide does not enter the light reaction. What enters the light reaction? Water. Water, light, our electron carrier, ADP, and inorganic phosphate. I'm going to summarize this all for you on the board in a minute, but I'm just going to talk you through the slide first, and then I'm going to write it all on the board. So water enters the light reaction, and water is going to be split apart. The hydrogens are going to be picked up by the electron carrier. So NADP plus is the electron carrier. It's going to pick up those hydrogens and become NADPH. ADP is going to be phosphorylated in this membrane of the thylakoid by ATP synthase, and it's going to form ATP. These two now go on to be the energy source of the Calvin cycle. ATP and NADPH are going to go into the Calvin cycle and be the energy source to reduce CO2 to form sugars. Oxygen gets released during the light reaction because as the NADP plus picks up the hydrogens after the water split, all that's left is oxygen. That gets released from the plant. Let's summarize what I just said on the board. Again, I'm going to say plant, but I'm really referring to all photosynthetic organisms when I say that. Okay, so here's the board. Hoping I have a marker that works well here. Okay, so light reaction. Where is this occurring? It's occurring in the thylakoid, in both the lumen and the thylakoid membrane. Gosh, I'm really sorry that glare is really bad on the board. I'm going to write it below here so you can see it a little bit better. Thylakoid. Okay, so we start with, in other words, these are our reactants. Water, ADP, which was regenerated by the Calvin cycle, inorganic phosphate, our electron carrier, NADP plus, and light energy. Multiple steps of the light reaction. Water is going to get split apart. So we're going to end with oxygen getting released. ATP synthase in the thylakoid membrane is going to phosphorylate ADP to form ATP. That's going to be the energy source of the Calvin cycle. NADP plus picks up those hydrogens to become NADPH. These two are now going to go into the Calvin cycle. This is released from the plant. Again, this is a very, very basic overview of photosynthesis without giving you the details of all those stages. Calvin cycle. Also called the light-independent reaction. Light does not enter the Calvin cycle, and it's taking place in the stroma of the chloroplast, that liquid region of the chloroplast. We start with, well, we don't, but the plant starts with CO2. Remember, CO2 does not enter the light reaction. Carbon dioxide is not coming into photosynthesis until the Calvin cycle. ATP and NADPH come in and they are an energy source, and I'll show you the details of that in a minute. But this is going to become ADP, and this is going to become NADP plus. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I'm showing what we're starting with. God, those came in, so we start with, I just showed you what we ended with. We start with these because this is what comes in. Okay, sorry about that. This is what we start with. We end with, I'm gonna have to put what we end with down here. Carbon dioxide is going to get reduced. Those hydrogens are going to join up with CO2, and we're going to produce some carbohydrates. In fact, we're going to produce something called G3P. Again, we aren't doing it, the plants are. I don't know why I keep saying we. So you're going to end with something called G3P, which is a carbohydrate and that can become any of the sugars the plant needs, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Remember, when I say CO2 is reduced, reduction means a gain of electrons. So gain of electrons is reduction. And remember, sometimes that electron can be in the form of hydrogen. Loss of electrons is oxidation, which could also be loss of hydrogen. In this case, carbon dioxide is going to gain hydrogen to become carbohydrates, such as glucose, sucrose, fructose, starch. So we say that carbon dioxide is reduced. So what do we end with? We're going to end with carbohydrate from the reduction of CO2. We're going to end with ADP, and we're going to end with NADP plus. Sorry, I know that's a lot on one messy board. I really wish that I had a bigger board to show you this. But let me show you this on a slide. So this is the summary slide. Here's an even better, less messy summary slide. Water enters the light reaction. It takes place in the thylakoid, in both the thylakoid membrane and the lumen of the thylakoid. Goes through a series of steps. Light is harnessed. Water is split apart. Oxygen is released. The hydrogens are picked up by the electron carrier, which also entered the light reaction along with ADP and inorganic phosphate. ADP is phosphorylated to form ATP using ATP synthase, which I'll show you again in a minute. Here's our electron carrier carrying hydrogens. Those go into the Calvin cycle. So here we start with the ATP and the NADPH that were produced in the light reaction. Now CO2 enters. Carbon dioxide enters. It's going to get reduced to form sugars, and that regenerates NADP plus. In addition, we had to use some energy to reduce CO2. That required energy. Where'd the energy come from? Came from two places. One, a concentration gradient that was set up, and also through the phosphorylation of another molecule, we regenerated ADP. You don't need to know the details of the phosphorylation of what molecule, but just know that in the Calvin cycle, we, quote, use ATP. Remember, when we use ATP, what that means, it's a good reminder of what happens when we, quote, use ATP. So adenosine, gosh, sorry. And remember, this isn't really the structure of it. Adenosine triphosphate. That third phosphate group is a high energy bond. Those are negatively charged phosphate groups. When we force that third one on, it's like spring loaded. When that gets transferred to another molecule, it gives that other molecule energy to do something. So we're going to transfer that third phosphate group to another molecule. And that leaves us with adenosine with two phosphate groups. So this is called ATP, adenosine triphosphate, and this is ADP, adenosine diphosphate. That's just a quick review of phosphorylation. So that's how we regenerate the ADP during the Calvin cycle. These now go back into the light reaction. This is the membrane of the thylakoid. So this is the thylakoid membrane. And you can see what they've done is they've taken this upper part of one of these thylakoids and they've blown up the membrane. So that means the stroma is all this area out here. And then the lumen is the part inside. So that would be on this side of the diagram. It'd be reversed if they showed like the bottom of one of these, because these proteins and phospholipids go around the entire thylakoid. This should look familiar. This should look a lot like what was happening in the inner membrane of a mitochondrion during cellular respiration. These proteins include the photosystem that will harvest light, which is going to split water apart, oxygen and hydrogens. The oxygen is released. Hydrogens are going to get pumped across and they're going to build up in the lumen of the thylakoid. The energy to pump these hydrogens across comes from the electron transport chain, from these electrons moving through these proteins of the electron transport chain. Remember that charged ions cannot just cross the phospholipid bilayer. So this is producing a concentration gradient. Remember, concentration gradients are a source of energy, just like ATP is. These cannot just cross the phospholipid bilayer, but they can go through ATP synthase. So ATP synthase is the enzyme used in photosynthesis to phosphorylate ADP to form ATP. So as these hydrogens build up, this concentration gradient is an energy source. As they move through the ATP synthase, we generate ATP. You can also see that as those hydrogens come across, they're going to get picked up by the electron carriers. So now NADPH and ATP that were made by the ATP synthase, those two are now going to go into the Calvin cycle and be the energy source for the Calvin cycle. So I just kind of wanted to show you that detail. Here's a summary again. So light enters the light reaction. So does water, our electron carrier, and ADP and inorganic phosphate. What are we going to make? O2, ATP, and ADPH. These enter the Calvin cycle along with carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide gets reduced to form sugars. We regenerate our electron carrier and we regenerate the ADP. Again, I'm saying we, but I mean the plant. I don't know why I'm saying we. Okay, just to quickly compare cell respiration and photosynthesis, you should already know what happens in cell respiration, but again, what serve as the reactants in one are the products in the other. Cell respiration is exergonic, meaning it releases energy. Photosynthesis requires energy, so it's endergonic. Cell respiration was breaking glucose apart. Photosynthesis is putting glucose together. So catabolic versus anabolic. Electron carriers are different. So the electron carrier in photosynthesis is NADP+. In both, ATP synthase phosphorylates ADP to form ATP. That's pretty cool. Oops. This is a minor detail. You don't need to memorize that, but it's kind of cool to think they kind of happen in reverse. So cell respiration starts in the cytosol, which is the liquid portion of the cytoplasm, and then it moves into the structure. Okay, photosynthesis starts in a structure and then moves out into the fluid. So it starts in the thylakoid and then it moves out into the stroma. So that's kind of in reverse. They both use an electron transport chain. I'm just going to go through a few questions so you have a good idea of how I want you to understand photosynthesis for the test. So first, you should be able to write the general equation for photosynthesis and show which reactant is oxidized and which one is reduced. So remember, loss of electrons is oxidation, Leo, and GR, gain of electrons is reduction. Leo the lion says GR. So remembering that, let's look at the general formula first for photosynthesis. Stop sharing for a minute so you can see the board better. Okay, so general equation for photosynthesis. You don't need to worry about the numbers, but I'll just go ahead and write them since they're typically written. Carbon dioxide and water. You could also write these in reverse. Remember, water enters the light reaction, carbon dioxide enters the Calvin cycle. Typically, glucose is the carbohydrate that's shown, and oxygen. So gain of electrons is reduction, loss of electrons is oxidation. Remember, that can also mean hydrogen. For carbon dioxide to become glucose, did it gain hydrogen or did it lose hydrogen? Well, this doesn't have hydrogen and this does. How do I know that carbon dioxide wasn't becoming oxygen? The way I know that is because we're not talking about carbon moving around. Carbon's not moving around in this process. It's hydrogen that's moving around. Remember, hydrogen is picked up by the electron carrier and dropped off by the electron carrier. So it's hydrogen that's moving around. This is a gain of hydrogen, which is a gain of electrons, and that's reduction. So reduction is the noun. Remember, we can say that carbon dioxide is reduced to form glucose. Water gets split apart and becomes oxygen. For water to become oxygen, did it gain electrons or lose electrons? In other words, did it gain hydrogen or lose hydrogen? Well, oxygen doesn't have hydrogen, so it must have lost hydrogen. Loss of hydrogen is oxidation. In other words, we can say that water is oxidized to form oxygen. Okay, so there's your answer. Water is oxidized to form oxygen. Carbon dioxide is reduced to form glucose. And again, you can put the reactants and the products in either order. Is photosynthesis an endergonic reaction or an exergonic reaction, and why? So we talked about this earlier. Remember, in photosynthesis, we're starting off with reactants that don't have a lot of energy at all, and we're ending up with a product that has a lot of energy. So that required energy input. So it's endergonic, and energy input is required because the reactants have less energy than the products. Or you could say because the products have more energy than the reactants, saying the same thing. Which organisms carry out photosynthesis? Cyanobacteria, photosynthetic protists, and plants. So it's not all protists, and it's definitely not all bacteria, but it is all plants. Where in the plant cell does photosynthesis take place? This is just in general. It takes place in the chloroplasts. Where specifically does the light reaction take place? In the thylakoid of the chloroplast. So the thylakoid is part of the chloroplast. What are the required ingredients? In other words, what do we start with in the light reaction? What are the reactants? So remember, it's not both of these that enter. It's only one. It's water. Okay, then we need ADP, NADP plus. I left out the inorganic phosphate here. And then light energy from the sun. What is made? What are the ending products of the light reaction? That water becomes oxygen. ADP gets phosphorylated by ATP synthase to form ATP. And NADP plus picks up the hydrogens from the water and becomes NADPH. Where specifically is the electron transport chain located in the light reaction? In the thylakoid membrane. What enzyme is involved in phosphorylating ADP to form ATP during the light reaction? Our friend ATP synthase. What products of the light reaction enter the Calvin cycle? That would be the ATP and the NADPH. Those are now energy sources for the Calvin cycle. Requires energy to reduce CO2. So now CO2 enters. So what other reactant enters? CO2. Carbon dioxide does not enter the light reaction. It does not enter until the Calvin cycle. Where specifically does the Calvin cycle take place? Okay, it's in the chloroplast, but what part of the chloroplast? It's in the stroma of the chloroplast. The ending products of the Calvin cycle, G3P, and then ADP is regenerated and NADP plus is regenerated. Those can then enter the light reaction again. What molecules can plants make from G3P? Any of the carbohydrates it needs. Remember, starch is the storage form of glucose for a plant. Cellulose makes up the plant cell wall. Sucrose is how plants transport sugars. Malt sugar is only found in certain plants, and fructose is primarily in the fruiting structures of certain flowering plants. Okay, and this is the very last question, and then we're done with photosynthesis. In photosynthesis, plants take blank energy and convert it to blank energy. In other words, what kind of energy is used and what is it converted to in photosynthesis? So plants take light energy and convert it to chemical energy. That's photosynthesis. Thank you.